Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started about 2 minutes here. Give everybody a couple minutes to trickle on in. While we wait, Pinky and or Eric, do you guys have any sweet jokes to share with our audience?
Let's put me on the spot. I do not have a sweet joke, unfortunately. I wish I did now.
Yeah. Where's Brad when you need him?
I know, right?
Yeah.
So let's see. Why did the tomato turn red?
I don't know.
Because it saw the salad dressing.
All right. So you guys can rate these jokes. Send a message with your score.
Yeah, I think you
Yeah,
made the
yeah.
emphasis a little different
I'll,
there.
I'll agree with
It
that.
took me like a good while to process that one, man.
Definitely stole that off of Fazoli's cup a few
Oh
years
yeah.
ago. Yeah.
I miss Laffy Taffy.
Uh, oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I got an 8. I got an 8. All right, thank you.
All right, that's not bad. That's really not
Being
bad at all.
very generous.
I also see a 2 in there,
I
and
don't.
but
No,
someone said a dad out of 10, so I think
pretty
that's good.
close. Pretty
That's
good.
probably the most accurate one.
It's valid.
All right, cool. Let's get rolling. You guys ready?
Let's do it.
Sweet. Hey, everybody, welcome to Under the Hood, our second edition. We do appreciate your time and joining us here today. We hope that this will be informative for you, that you'll get some actionable information you can take back to your company and personal and just help you guys out. So before we get started, I just want to do quick intros. Got a couple of new folks joining us today. So first, we got Eric Hansen. He's our penetration testing team lead here at FRSecure. So good afternoon, Eric. How are you doing today?
Doing well.
Happy to have you, man. Uh,
Thanks.
then we also have Pinky. Pinky is our IR team lead. Thanks for joining us today, Pinky. How you doing?
Hey, I'm fine. Doing good.
Yeah, excellent. Well, cool. We'll dig right in. I did have a cool meme I wanted to share with everyone, um, but I don't think I'm going to. I'll just share the message. It's been a rather rough couple of months for us here, specifically on the blue team side, with the imminent attack on healthcare that we saw beginning of Q4, and then followed up by Solari Gate, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Um, Hopefully that'll be beneficial to you guys. But if anybody's ever seen the movie Boys in the Hood, there's this beautiful scene where Ice Cube's giving a man a hug and he says, "Take a deep breath. It's just a bad day, not a bad life." And that's something we all have to keep in mind, specifically on the blue team. It can get overwhelming sometimes, and we're sure that you guys are feeling this as well. And so that's why we want to do these series, is to take the things that we learn, be able to share that with you, and hopefully help you and your defenses moving forward. Um, anyway, cool. So let's dig right in. I got a couple of news headlines today, and I did try to keep Solarigate out of the news headlines as much as possible because we're going to have a whole lot of that later as we talk through things. And so I want to hit some other points on things that we saw recently here that you may not have heard of because we know the solar wind stuff is taking up most of the airspace continually right now. And so we'll dig right in. The first is there was a vulnerability released, actually 3 specific CVEs released for the Fortinet web application firewall that can essentially expose your networks to attack. At this point, details are still coming out on this one. We do know it was a SQL injection and a buffer overflow without authentication. So I don't know, Eric, if you want to take an opportunity to maybe explain what the SQL injection and buffer overflow attacks could mean for folks, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the versions and things.
Yeah, absolutely. With the SQL injection attack, or vulnerability, you're taking advantage of unsanitized data being kind of injected straight into a query string, right? Back when we first started programming, developing SQL related applications, that was pretty normal. We kind of just trusted things, right? And you just take a parameter that gets put in and send it through, and then not really worry too much about it. Just going, hey, if this ID equals 5, then return the query for that object. These days we're a lot smarter about that typically, but sometimes they still slip through. And what happens is if it's not sanitized, you can essentially alter the command structure or the query structure, of that that query and change it to do other things. And it can get pretty complicated. You can dive pretty deep into it, but essentially you're able to change the logic of that query and have it return other data and ask it other types of things to kind of pull data out of other database tables or gain access to other things in there. This one in particular was a blind SQL injection, which means it doesn't return any kind of data directly to the page. It actually works off of other types of mechanisms, such as returning an error or not, or returning having a delay or not if the data is correct or the search is correct. And so you can then kind of say, hey, like, does the password hash begin with an A? If so, take 5 seconds to respond, otherwise don't. And then you can kind of figure those things out. And so that's kind of like the high level look at it, but you can kind of extract all the data out of that. And then further, depending on the configuration of the server, sometimes it even means that you can get operating system command injection or other types of reverse web shells out of it and stuff like that, depending on if you have write access to areas or things like that. So it can lead to very much further compromise than the database in some scenarios.
Sure. And this what stuck out to me, and this is what we were talking about before, we hopped on here, was like knowing this may be an avenue like we see in a lot of other attacks we're going to talk about, where they may be able to extract data from a database or a table within that database that may have your admin username, your admin password, then use that, right, to pivot back in and gain valid access to your WAF. And at that point, they can really, modify your configuration, give themselves access into your environment if you're using VPN or anything else that may be associated. We see that with a lot of the Fortinet software, is maybe that WAF is tied into other interfaces as well. They could use the WAF as a pivot point to maybe hit your VPN, your firewall, or other things.
Yeah, and even if for some reason you can't crack the password, you can't just rely on passwords being good. Strong passwords, so then the hash can't be cracked, because realistically, if they have access to the database, they can potentially read session cookies or session data, write session data for themselves to make themselves logged in as an admin, even if they don't have those credentials. So
right.
Once you have control of the database, you have a lot of control generally of the application, the appliance that you're attacking.
For sure. And one thing that we found that was very interesting about this is when Fortinet, they were disclosed this vulnerability through a researcher, and they assigned the CVSS rating themselves, and they assigned it a 6.4, which is a medium. Based on what we know in the real world, this should fall in line with, somewhere between a 9.5 and a 10, probably a critical rating. I have seen, it looks like maybe they are going to rescore that, obviously from pressure from outside folks. But so if you see that it is rated as a medium right now, you should be concerned about that. We would recommend that you actively patch that. We're sure that this is public, the exploit's known now, and that there are going to be public active exploit attempts against that. We will be sending you out some notes on this, but the big thing to know is your affected versions, right? So if you're using a FortiWeb 6.3.7 or below, or a FortiWeb 6.2.3 or below, those are affected. They do have patches and upgrades available, so we recommend that you schedule and apply those as soon as possible. So moving right along here, the next thing, we're kind of doing a redo of something we talked about very briefly last week, and that was a bug in VMware associated to CVE 2024-006. This bug exists in the administrative configurator of VMware. That's your port 8443. This is something that's set up on your initial VMware deployment. It's a kind of set and forget password. So a lot of folks probably set that password when they configured their VM installation 2, 3, 4 years ago, and haven't changed it since. It does require authentication. And the fear here is, right, you stored that password in a credential or a text file or something that could be stolen by an attacker, or it's an easily guessable password. And they're able to use that password to gain access to your VMware console. If they do, they essentially have authority at that point to execute anything within your VMs themselves, within your VM environment. And the configurator port isn't meant to do that. That's why this is important. They can pivot over and make changes to systems, execute commands on systems, and so on. It's relevant to bring that up again this month because the NSA did put out a warning that they are observing Russian state-sponsored hackers that are actively exploiting this in the wild. So we just want to reiterate that, make sure you guys were aware of that. The things we request are obviously apply those patches. There are fixes for it. More importantly, though, lock down access to that configurator port. There's no reason it should be open to public networks. Even if you have the opportunity internally to lock it down to only trusted IPs, folks that should be accessing that, we would request that you do that. And then also make sure that configurator password is complex and properly secured. If you're sitting there right now saying, what the heck is my configurator password? You probably want to go change that when we get off the call and make sure it's secure. So I don't know, Pinky, Eric, anything you guys would like to say about that?
No, exactly that. But I mean, it is, you're exactly right on setting those up, and you just fire off a garbage password or something to set them up. Did VMware installs years ago, and it's pretty common to do that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
probably a lot of
Yeah.
those out there.
I can say one thing I've seen a lot, not necessarily with VMware configurations, but just in general, if you set the password 5 years ago or something like that, it's probably bad. I
Yeah.
mean, like as a red teamer, just seeing some of the stuff that if you have a password that you set a while back, it just seems like our password practices have gotten so much better as
Mhm.
security staff, IT staff, stuff like that in the last few years than they used to be. That it's just a good practice in general.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And that's something too we know, and this isn't, dogging anyone, but a lot of times when folks are setting up these technologies, they think that configurator port, it's not really used for much. It's my initial configuration. I'm not going to worry about that. What can attacker do anyway if they have access to it? So I got this garbage password I use for all those things. They set it, they forget it. And here we are 4 to 5 years later, and it's being actively exploited. So go fix that today if you can. Our final piece of news before we go into our deep dive today is going to be talking about SASA actually released a free detection tool for Azure and M365. This tool is called Sparrow. It's sparrow.ps1. It's a PowerShell script. It seems pretty simple. You can run this against your Azure or 365 environment to look for signs of compromise. And this is relevant to our deep dive topic, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But want to make sure you guys were aware of that. And I don't know, Pink, if you want to tell the folks about some of the functionality within that tool, may be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, I know we'll get deep into why this is important right now. But this is a great tool just anyway. These are a lot of things that we would do if we're coming in a blue team, or an instant response engagement scenario here, trying to look through your Office 365 for any indicators of compromise. And this goes pretty deep on this too. So it checks out a lot of things like, do you have any OAuth application consents out there? So one thing is a lot of those can be really insecure, and they can be a nice way to exploit the system. Also does a lot of, looking for that type of thing as well, searching app IDs, which will let them know, what you're trying to log in with and that type of thing. And then as well, and this is probably the more relevant part to what we're going to talk about here in a bit, is that it looks for the SAML token usage, and that plays in heavily with the Solari Gate stuff we're going to talk about just in a bit. But great tool, free and super easy to use, which is hard to say a lot of times about Office 365 tools. I mean, this is literally a PowerShell script, and it looks for some really common modules. I think it's 3 modules it searches for, and those are all easily installed if you don't already have them.
Mhm.
But yeah, grab this thing, run it, and see what you can find.
Yeah.
I've not gotten to take it for a test drive yet. I'm going to probably do that this afternoon or on Monday, but I'm pretty excited about trying it out.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something too, like you talk about, right? We would be doing these checks anyway through other scripting or manual efforts that we would do in a blue team engagement. But this is something we recommend people just do anyway. Like there's no reason why you shouldn't have someone who's looking into those cloud systems on a regular frequency for these signs of compromise, because there's so many attacks that we get called in on where that attacker's been sitting on the network for 2-3 months. And I mean, we've seen dwell times up to a year. And if they had been doing these checks before we came on board, the incident that occurred later would have never have happened. And so it's a good tool. It's easy to use. It's going to make doing those things you should be doing, you might not be doing right now, a lot easier. So I'd say get on it. All right, cool. So I guess let's dig into SolariGate, SolarWinds Orion exploit. I know that this has filled the news. It's probably been on a lot of folks' mind who's on here today. And we've probably even worked with some of you folks on this already. We've been helping a lot of clients out, and there's a lot to cover here. So I'm going to try to break this down into different phases, right? And so we think about this attack. There's really multiple phases. The first is the initial payload, and that's supernova. We'll dig into supernova a bit more. The second is that secondary payload known as teardrop. And then we'll talk about tertiary and beyond. So what they did beyond that we know. So there's 3 levels, maybe even more. And then talk about what we need to do to fix this. But then also talk about things you could have done. So even if you were affected by the malware, you wouldn't have had to worry about it. Um, And so that's going to be kind of the flow. If you guys do have questions you want to trickle in, fire away. We'll get to them hopefully. So let's just start with Supernova then. So as you guys all know, right, attackers were able to implement malicious code into the SolarWinds Orion product. That malicious code was a backdoor, essentially, if triggered, would allow access into your environment on that Orion system. At this time, we know the affected versions were 2019.4 through 2020.2. And that's 0.2 without the hot fix. And that's relevant here because of the timeline, right? So that's the first thing that's pretty alarming when we dig into this attack. 2019 for the actual specific 2019 4 version that was released, was affected, was a hot fix version, I believe came out in March of 2020. And so that's our first interesting point I want to talk about, right? We had a payload that was deployed through valid software to paying customers throughout the world, included backdoor for a time period of roughly 8 to 9 months before it was detected. Um, Now, if we want to open up and chat about that a little bit and the implications there and why that creates challenges for us, I can start with saying to be able to give folks a full, clean bill of health when we come in and investigate, that means you got to have that 9-10 months worth of records. And so one of the most important things that we've done when we come in to investigate these is to really identify the exposure window. And what we mean by that is identifying if you have the affected software installed on your system, but then B, identifying when that affected software was installed, and then using that as a pivot point in our investigation to see what may have happened between the installation time and when we were called in to investigate. I don't know, Pinky and Eric, if you guys got thoughts around that.
No, I mean it's pretty well sums it up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and the big thing I want to clear up too is I've heard this called a vulnerability, and we want to make sure folks understand this is not a vulnerability. This was malware that was installed on your network from a trusted supplier. So, you know, make sure you understand that there is a big difference. So with the backdoor, we want to talk about what that backdoor would allow the attacker to do, right? So this would allow the attacker to transfer files in and out of your network, would allow them to execute files, execute commands on the local system, profile the system. They could even use that payload to actually reboot the system. So if they were trying to install recon tools or other tools that may have required a restart for some reason, they could even restart your system. They could shut down services. Specifically, we've seen that they targeted endpoint detection, antivirus, and so on. But more importantly here, this stage in the attack was just the initial exploit. All the news really circled around Supernova, and it is important to understand this is bad. There's a lot of implications on source code control for SolarWinds and how they may have missed some things they should have been able to identify. And they're still trying to figure out, I think, how that happened. We'll talk about that in our quick hits later. But the big thing here is to understand the fix to this isn't just to get the malware off your network. The real fear here is that they triggered the back door and then they used that back door to go to the secondary payload. And that's what we're going to dig into next. But first, to talk about how to remediate this, it's simple, right? You got to get that effective version off your systems, make sure you're fully patched, you're on the new version. There are some IOCs that we've shared through email that we'll be sharing with you that you can investigate your local system for to see if there are presence of these files, which may indicate they actively triggered that back door and were on your system. There's specifically some domain names that were affected that are pretty good indicators that you can use. Again, that requires you having historical access to those proxy logs or internet logs to see if those domains were contacted during the entirety of that vulnerable or that exploited package being installed on your system. So we'll share all that detail with you guys, but I think more importantly now, let's skip on over and talk about Teardrop, because for me, this is kind of the meat and potatoes. This is how they bring the pain. And so with Teardrop, essentially it's the secondary attack. Teardrop was a memory only dropper. So they used the initial payload to trigger a backdoor, which reached out to a malicious domain. That malicious domain then would deploy a memory only dropper on the system. It was often masqueraded as a JPEG. A common file that was being used was known as gracious_truth.jpg. It wasn't really a JPEG. It actually included an embedded payload that executed a custom Cobalt Strike beacon. And so this is an attack chain we're very familiar with. Eric is very familiar with as well. And so I don't know, Eric, if you want to talk a little bit about the implications and what that may mean, and specifically explain to folks what that memory only dropper is and how that memory only dropper is used in the attack chain.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to it. As far as first in the delivery, obviously using a JPEG and kind of encoding data into it is actually a very simple task. It's something we do on some of our droppers as well. It's just obfuscating data inside of an image and then pulling it out. As long as it knows where to look, it knows what to grab, and it helps get past antivirus and, EDR, things like that. So, that's one of those types of tactics. As far as a memory only dropper, I mean, we're talking about something that's executing. It's not touching disk, right? And so it's, I mean, there's this side of it of saying, hey, if the system gets rebooted or for some reason that software is shut down or crashes, whatever, it's not going to be necessarily running anymore. It's going to go away to some extent, but also makes it a lot more difficult to kind of detect from an EDR perspective, especially because you can do certain types of in-memory evasion, right? So when it's not touching that disk, and that's one less vector to be detected on. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And we see so a big challenge, I think, in our investigations here was initially when this was reported, a lot of folks started powering down their Orion boxes and they started rebooting those Orion boxes. And so when that happened, as an investigator, we lost a lot of artifacts that could determine if you were affected or if you weren't affected. And so, it's tough. People get in these situations. You want to do the right thing. You got a malicious box on your network and they've got reactions to go shut it down. We always say, don't shut it down. Disconnect the network. That's fine, but leave that active memory running. So when we come in and we're doing our analysis, we can see that because like Eric had mentioned, we're saying this only lives in memory. And so when we do forensics, one of the things we focus on is doing a file timeline. So we look at everything that touches your disk, identifying when those things touch the disk and, trying to map together the story and solve the problem or I guess solve the case. So when systems rebooted or shut down, those artifacts are gone. We can't see that anymore. So that becomes a challenge. So the interesting thing here that we knew they were using that for, is essentially standard red team attack techniques like we do in our penetration tests. They get the beacon on your system. It's the same beacon that we use for internal penetration tests. And then from there, they go through a standard internal pen test methodology where they're going to try to enumerate your domain, run recon, identify information, accounts, and so on that they can use for other means of access. And so in this case specifically, we can see that, when they were in there, they were looking to see if you guys were using cloud resources, if you guys were using VPNs, if you had anything that could be legitimately connected to from the internet, and they could identify credentials inside that could be used to connect back into those systems. That was the goal of this phase. And so the idea is to get in, harvest everything we can so that we can get back out and then reconnect right under your nose, and you'll never notice because we're not going to use any malicious techniques. So yeah, I don't know, Eric or Pinky, if you guys want to expand on that or chat about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I do, because I think the important thing, and this is something I think a lot of people miss here, is that was the goal, is to have those to come back in with those legitimate tactics, or whatever C2 framework they can get implemented, that kind of thing. But let's think about the timeline on this, right? If you updated like we tell you to on time, back in March when this came out, these guys could have came in, grabbed what they needed, and been connected since then, technically. And we may not see that if you don't have those levels of logs like you were talking about. And I think that's really the big scary, I hate to say scary because we need to keep calm with this kind of stuff, but I think that's the big thing for me, is just to understand, right? Like, yeah, that initial way in and then that secondary payload there, that was really, that could have been done in March, and everything else has been since then. And that's what we're really looking for when we do threat hunting and that kind of thing, and going out to see what else we can find, see what else they may have left behind, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the big thing, which will kind of segue into the next piece now after we get through, I guess, that's the main thing for Teardrop. I want folks to understand this was really where the pain came. When they came in, they harvest your domain and they identify legitimate methods of access to get back into your network. Now, like the goals, right? What they wanted to do and what they're doing, we still don't know. Like we're gonna learn about this, I think, for a long time because there wasn't a lot of active ransoming going on, right? We've seen that. We also seen they had a lot of high-profile targets that obviously have been exposed now, and we'll talk about one of those later. But we also know that they did trigger on some lower profile targets too. It's possible they were able to achieve their goals, which is to harvest that information and establish those secondary means of connection into your infrastructure. And the third thing, which is something that I see and I have a lot of experience in the past, is that sometimes when they're in, that dwell time, we go back to that. The dwell times can be extensive. And so this could be a prolonged attack where there are attackers that are sitting on your systems, your networks, dwelling until an opportune time to come in for, another phase of this attack. And that's, what scares me. And I don't want to fearmonger like Pinky had said, but that's why we want to talk about in the next phase here some of those things they're doing and some of the things that you guys can be doing to just make sure that if they did harvest that information, you're going to get them out, and that's our goal, right? And there's always going to be that active unknown where they could have harvested those accounts, verified they work, and they're not connecting. They're just sitting back. It's easy. I'm sure Eric could talk about this. If you're profiling a domain, right, to find a power user with a password that doesn't expire, and you think about if you had those credentials, it's not a golden ticket, but it's a pretty damn good ticket that they could use at a later time to reestablish connectivity into your network.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier too. Like if you have passwords that are over 5 years old or something, they're probably pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we see a ton when we're doing internal penetration testing, or red teaming in general. We see a lot of these non-expiring service accounts and things like that are overprivileged and they can last forever. Once they get compromised, you might tell everyone in your company to change your passwords, but every one of you that has that in their environment right now, if I told you, hey, you need to go change these 5 service account passwords, are going, what does that affect? What is that going to look like? How long does it take to do that?
Right.
It's much more of a headache than it sounds, right, at first glance. And so it's definitely something. And I do want to speak to this before we move on real fast too. It's just that this type of behavior is something that you're going to see in more sophisticated attacks in general, right? When we do an internal pen test, when I say this type of behavior, I mean doing memory only type droppers and then trying to live off the land after that, right? Living off the land is a term that's used a lot to kind of reference this, of we're going to use your normal infrastructure, your normal administrative tools, things like that, right? So it's the more and more sophisticated the attack becomes, the more and more you're really looking at your own tooling as being the thing that is being used to attack you. Especially in this instance because it's legit software that then got compromised, right? But it can be tough because at some point you can get this false sense of security of saying, well, our EDRs aren't picking anything up. It's like, well, no, because they're using your tools at this point.
Yep.
So.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's like one of the points Evan tries to drive home a lot, and it's like Pink we were talking about. I think this morning too, like cover the simple stuff. If you monitor actually what you're using and those technologies you are using, don't rely on your security stack. Rely on following these best practices and looking for these things, and that's going to be your best means of protection. And I think, yeah, you're right. Things are evolving more in that direction. So the interesting thing we'll say about this too is that a lot of the attacks we've seen that when they get in and they deploy Cobalt Strike, they kind of use Cobalt Strike as their initial um, you know foothold in your network, right? So that's how they get in, and then they will use those legitimate tools to execute attacks. A lot of the attacks we work with the C2 end in ransom, right? But this attack's a little bit different in that the fact that the attackers are burning down their C2s, and so they would essentially go in, harvest what they need, and then they destruct and destroy the C2s that were in there. And then they also destruct the log evidence that related to those C2s and detection capabilities. And so they were like a ghost in the night. They came in, they got what they needed, and they snuck back out. And so it's, really important that we understand when we're doing these investigations that we don't just focus on, the presence of the C2. Because we know that was used in their attack vector. If they were able to reach their goal, which is harvesting the information needed to come back in through alternate means, then likely that C2 is gone. And it's possible that those artifacts that the C2 generated during the stand-up are also gone. And so that's why it's so important that we, going back to that Sparrow tool, right, that we start to look at all the other avenues of connections into our networks. And I think it's important that as business owners and our clients and partners here, and if you guys are curious about how to protect from this, it's obviously do that needful stuff and, hunt for these C2s and look for the obviously malicious things. But more so, it's profiling your own environment, your own business to understand what your public access points are, and making sure first you completely understand those. You have a good inventory of what those public access points are. We see some folks don't even really understand that. Make sure you understand that as well. And then make sure those protocols are properly secured. The same old best practices we always talk about. If you've got a public portal where you can log into your network, have secure passwords, make sure you have good policies around that, make sure you have multi-factor authentication, and more so, make sure you're monitoring those systems. Don't trust that your security stack is still going to prevent an exploit. You monitor those systems to make sure there are no abuse. And that's going back to that Sparrow tool. That's a tool that's something that's easy for you guys to look through your Azure or Office 365 environment. But we know that's not comprehensive. We know there's other avenues of connections into your network that you guys need to be keeping an eye on. So I don't know, Pink or Eric, if you guys got thoughts or want to add to that.
Just a big amen, right? Check. Let's
Yeah.
right. Not sure how else to put it. Pretty good there.
Yeah. So the other thing, this is painful, but it's going back to what Eric said. So if you guys had the affected version, you had the malware on your environment, we are requesting that you do, password resets. Look at doing an enterprise password reset because just like Eric mentioned, I bet you got some service accounts that are 5-6 years old using the same password that has way too many privileges anyway. So now's a good time to do that. I would recommend getting started on that. And, it's good exercise to do for your domain health anyway at a semi-regular process. And then, we have to mention this and, it's painful, but curb TGT. We know that a lot of times the attackers will try to harvest the curb TGT. You've probably never reset your curb TGT password. It is recommended you do an annual reset of that anyway. So if you're on here right now and you're saying, what's a curb TGT? I would do some Googling. We'll share a link with you in our notes on Microsoft's advised process to do that. But I don't know, Eric, if you want to explain that account and the power of that account and why that's relevant here in this attack scenario.
Yeah, at a high level, I'll just say that, the way that authentication works in a domain environment and stuff with is essentially taking a hash and signing, right? Like we sign all kinds of things, whether it be, SSL type traffic or TLS traffic or, JWTs these days, or all kinds of different things. We're signing it with something, right? So obviously the key that's being used to sign it is important. It needs to maintain security, right? Well, if that gets compromised, you can sign whatever authorization authentication tokens you want. You can sign them yourself, and they just get taken as like, yeah, that must be valid because it's signed by the authority that signs these things. So essentially, that's what we're talking about here at a high level. Mm-hmm. And the impact of that is that not only can you log in as any user in the environment, regardless of what their password is, how often it was changed, or anything like that, but you could actually just create completely false accounts and use those in the environment as well. You can assign permissions to a user that they don't normally have, it's not a permanent assignment. It's a temporary assignment, just saying, hey, I'm this user and I have this permission. And then the thing's like, are you sure? It's like, well, it's signed properly, so I guess so. Essentially is what it comes down to. So it's very important to make sure that that is rotated, I'd say. And especially if you ever have any kind of compromise or breach, as these guys will tell you on the blue team side, it's just something you got to do every time that you have a scenario like that, because if they get that, it doesn't matter what changes you make, you can always just sign whatever you want and kind of re-authenticate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, how many times do we come into these engagements and we see, talking about the 5-year-old passwords and that kind of thing, right? An old SA account or something like that that's been there for who knows how long with a password and sitting there as a domain admin or something. And once you have that, you can achieve that golden ticket like you're talking about there. And and exactly like Eric said, right? I mean, just impersonate whatever. And from a blue team side of things, that's a huge headache for us to try to track at that point. It's really obvious when you see an account that's 18 squiggly letters and nothing that makes sense, right? But it's not often the case. It'll be admin slightly misspelled, or it'll be, admin instead of administrator. And then we got to go talk to your IT team and find out, is that a valid account? Should that be doing what it's doing, and things like that? Should the person in accounting actually be able to go and delete PowerShell logs on the server? Probably not, and that's going to be a flag. But it's still, man, it's really difficult to track that once an attacker has it. So I do love the idea of the at least yearly reset. I think I've heard some folks talk about doing it, every 6 months or so. It's painful, and I don't think it's as painful as it used to be, though. I'll say that. So definitely something to look into. And like Oscar said, we'll have some information there for you to
I think
see how to do that.
the biggest pain point now is the time. It takes 2 resets to successfully complete the process, and each reset takes a significant period of time. So I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of folks, is getting that time they need to properly go through that process.
I just want to say, just in case.
So I think another thing I did want to bring up. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I think we had a little delay there. I was just going to say that as Piggy was just saying, it was like it might be something misspelled, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a completely legitimate account, and it can be a completely legitimate account with its legitimate permissions. If I'm sitting there trying to be low and slow in a red team or something like that, and I'm using a golden ticket, I'm just gonna find the person who has the rights I want and make a token for them. And for what it looks like for you, that person's doing exactly what they have permission to do. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And and something else too here. I know Oscar's having a little bit of a delay there.
Hey guys, I'm getting a little bit of lag here.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Why don't you tell them a little bit about the duo defeat, Pink?
Sure. Yeah, we'll do. And so what Oscar's talking about here too is, so one of the other things that came about from this SolarWinds attack, and seeing how it was actually being exploited out in the wild, we got word that even with multi-factor, right? So one of the things you're going to hear from security people all the time is turn on multi-factor, turn off multi-factor, turn on multi-factor, turn on multi-factor, multi-factor everything. We're always going to say that, and you still should. This is in no way me saying that you shouldn't do that. But one of the really interesting things that happened with this attack was we saw where if people were using Outlook Web Access, so you've got an internal Exchange server, that kind of thing, and you're publishing Outlook Web Access, but you're also doing multi-factor authentication with the Duo product, which is really popular. I mean, generally the big two we hear is Duo and Octo, if you're not using like the Microsoft Authenticator and things like that. But Duo is really huge, and a ton of people use it. So one of the things with this was that these attackers were able to harvest. I want to say it may have even been a certificate. I can't remember exactly how they were doing it, but they were able to defeat Duo on those OWA authentication methods. So that's a pretty big one, right? So if a lot of times we're relying on our MFA and things that, for a while there, I know Microsoft was saying, hey, let's stop changing passwords every so often and just rely on MFA and that kind of thing. But, keep that in mind. Nothing's perfect. Nothing's a silver bullet. And Eric, I don't know if you looked into that one any more than I did with the Duo defeat on this.
I didn't,
Okay.
But I can just say in general, when you're looking at multi-factor authentication, a lot of times you're talking about one-time pads and stuff like that are generated off of a secret, a secret per user or whatever the situation is. But it goes back to the same thing. If something's being used to generate, either encryption or a secret or something like that, the thing has to stay secure. And if it gets compromised, then that thing's gonna be compromised, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I was just checking my notes here. It's they were able to harvest the Duo integration secret. So, kind of that same type of things, kind of like a certificate that allows them to say, hey, I can get by this. So really, really interesting part of this that was a big wrench that kind of got thrown in there is, we rely on MFA, like you're saying. It's not always perfect. I think we got Oscar back here.
Nope. Just for a moment.
Yeah, guys, I'm getting some crazy lag, so I'm going to kill video and just stay on audio. Sorry about that.
Okay. But the takeaway there too, and I'm probably going to cut him off here because he's going to start talking after the delay. But like with everything else involved in this attack, and like everything else Oscar was talking about, go investigate your Duo setup. Go take a look at any kind of logs and anything you have there around that and OWA, and see if you have some things that look off to you. Right? I mean, if you're a completely domestic company and you have no one traveling to Russia, and you see logs on your OWA that you're getting logins from Russia, that even with MFA, then you might want to take a look at that and see if it's related here.
Yeah, for sure, man, for sure. I think the next thing too I want to talk about, I know we're getting about 3:40, is a good opportunity to talk about default deny. So again, this is something that we talk about, that that initial exploit required it to be triggered. That trigger reached out to a malicious domain. And then the malicious domain delivered the secondary payload, which is teardrop. And so we got to go back to those basics we're talking about. And if you had default deny implemented on your core infrastructure, at least, even if you had the malware deployed on your system, you would have never had to worry about any of those secondary or tertiary exploits that could have been applied. So, yeah, I don't know, Pink or Eric, if either of you guys want to expand on that a little bit.
Not, I mean, just on the default deny, obviously, when you're talking about something that's going to kind of reach back out, C2, reverse shells, things like that, a lot of the payloads that you're going to be end up getting, like if things can't get out, then they can't get out. You can't get those kind of callbacks to those things. You might still have some kind of scenario of a denial of service, eating up resources, shutting something down, things like that, if you have code execution, but something still can't kind of get out. But overall, it's going to protect you. It's a layer of protection to help out for sure.
Yeah, and it's kind of, like Oscar was saying there, it's one of these just foundational type things. And I know Eric is capable of doing some really cool, Mr. Robot type stuff and things like that. But a lot of times at the end of the day, our foundational problems are really what get us. I mean, most of the attacks we work are or a bad password or a badly configured service or somebody didn't, properly lock down a firewall, things like that. I mean, just your basic stuff. We have a tendency to look for the big cool thing, and this SolarWinds attack is kind of one of those, but then it goes back to basics after that too, right? So, like Oscar you said, the default deny would have made a huge difference in this all over. So, yep. And we may have lost Oscar completely. I'm not sure. Yeah, I believe we did.
Yeah, so
Okay. Well, we can hear you now, Oscar. But okay, yeah. All right, so for this point,
I think my audio is even coming in and out. So I don't know if anyone, if anyone can hear me right now. This is my daily internet almost outage. We got hit. I'm off the main circuit coming from Nashville, the bombing you guys I'm sure heard of on Christmas. Since Christmas, my internet's been a little sketchy, and every day about 3:30 to 4:30 Eastern time, I start to see this happen. And so it's right on cue today. I do apologize for everyone. Hopefully you can still hear me right now, but we would like to open up some Q&A for you guys. And we do got a couple quick points we can touch on briefly, but are there questions from you guys?
I know we did a good job explaining things, but surely there's going to be a couple questions.
Or everyone's asleep.
There's that too, yeah.
Either way, then we'll just drive on through. If you have questions, fire away. The other quick points, we want to talk about, these will just be quick touches. These will be in the notes that we send out. And I see Paul Hogan had commented on one of the things we were going to touch on today as well, which was actually the first headline I had on the quick hits, is that the Department of Justice confirmed that the SolarWinds hackers breached their O365 systems and did read email. I'm seeing the same thing Paul noted. No evidence at this time they hid classified information, but it is concerning as we continue to see how far this exploit touched. We'll share a link with that if you guys want to read more about that. Another key point too, and this is something that we had talked about early on in this entire exploit when things started going public, is that there was a report, a security researcher known as Vinath Kumar had alerted SolarWinds last year that the password to access their update server is SolarWinds 123. And so it could be related to how we got to this point. We're still unsure. Those pieces are being put together, but man, talk about those bad passwords again.
Fundamentals, right?
Yeah, just do the basics. Just do the basics. So cruising along, another piece of information that kind of slipped in over the holiday, so I'm not sure if everyone did see this, is that Microsoft did confirm that an account that was compromised by the Slarigate attackers was used to view source code in a large number of their repositories. And to me, that scares me. That's something that's going to concern me for a long time, because now we know that our attackers here at least viewed the source code, likely exfilled the source code for Microsoft products. I'm assuming, you have to assume, right? There's a large number of products they would want to target. But let's think about the implications of that. And that's something I'd like to chat with you guys about. The implication of a known attacker group having your source code. I don't know. You guys want to tell them why that's bad?
Yeah. No, go ahead, Eric. I saw you get ready to speak
No,
there.
I wasn't. I was reading questions, and I honestly wasn't listening. So I'm sorry.
Sure.
So.
No. I mean, so obviously, and Eric, I think will agree and probably back me up on this. I am no coder, but I've done a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, right, if you can look at source code, you can see the bones of the application. You can very quickly identify the problems there. If these attackers truly did have access to that source code, right, we're talking Windows and things like that potentially, on an unnameable amount of devices, and there's gonna find some holes. I just, it's kind of my feeling on this is they're very likely to find some holes. And the problem with that is that we're not talking about a vulnerability that's known at that point. We're talking true, 0-day gets thrown around a lot, but this could potentially be a true 0-day vulnerability that no one else is aware of and we can't really patch quickly.
Yeah, not only does it open up a lot of options for finding the issue, but it also speeds up the finding it so much. I mean, there's going to be a certain amount of, even if you have the source code and you're attacking an application, you're still going to be attacking it, just kind of going at it in your normal way. But you can immediately go, oh, there's an input here. I wonder how that's handled. I'm going to go refer to this. No, that's handled fine. Let's move on, right? You just you can kind of move through things a lot faster when you're trying to attack something. So.
Right. And so what I see this is, we know this was, likely a nation state, was my next headline, that now has the source code for the primary OS of the large majority of all of our domestic systems. And so, yeah, they're going to find exploits 0 days, and they're not going to they're not going to properly exercise responsible disclosure. We'll only see these things when we're probably called in to work on an incident, or other researchers identify these things being exploited in the wild. So that does scare me. And I know, something that we talked about earlier is Microsoft had announced, right, they weren't going to do like 2016 and beyond was the major, or 2019 was the major release. They weren't going to re-release another OS. It was going to be a continual update to that core that's out there, the foundational for operating systems now. So does that change that? Is that something they have to think about in the future? What do you guys think? I mean, can it be that deep? So they may have to do another full release of a core OS, or can they properly secure this now for 2-3 years down the road?
I'm having to think on that. I mean, it's tough. Depends on what they find there, right? I mean, I don't know. Potentially, yeah. I mean, realistically, there could be something that deep. It makes me. It's hard for me to believe that Microsoft wouldn't miss something that deep, but it's happened before.
Well,
So.
yeah, I'm not even saying they're going to miss anything that deep. I'm just saying that the idea that we have a nation state APT with the source code now, that the amount of 0 days that they could launch and have a toolbox of attacks that we're only going to find out as those materialize in the wild. And so we find one, it's burned, they've got another one. We find one, it's burned, they've got another. And so this rot could go on for years and years and years. And so is it possible they get to a point where we have to scrap that, start all over? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's impossible to kind of say.
Yeah, it's really tough. Very well could, I mean, honestly, just could be that.
Yep. Yeah, so the next big piece of news, and all these links we're sending out to, I did see someone had noted, Paul, you'd had a question about the VMware products that were affected by the CVE. We do have a link to the actual security bulletin released by VMware, so we'll make sure we include that in the update, and that'll give you all the information you need there. So the next thing, and this is kind of big news, this is something that from the research side that we've suspected since this broke, and that's kind of now been confirmed by the government. The government did release a joint statement. That was the work of the FBI, CISA, ODNI, as well as support from the NSA, and they was essentially formally pinned Russia for being behind the SolarWinds attack. This is not necessarily news to a lot of us, I think, who have been involved in this, but it was interesting to see that the government actually put out a statement on that. So we'll share that link with you guys if you want to read that and dig into it a little bit more. And then two more things real quick here. Security research team known as Red Drip. And this was something that we have put it out in our bulletins before, but they were able to decode part of the Sunburst exploit. And with that knowledge, they've put a decoder together. And so it's really cool. We've been using this on our investigations. If you identify calls to these malicious domains, you can run their decoder against those domains and see any data that have been exfilled. And so what I mean by that is they were tagging your domain, your business entity, but it was encoded in that command. So you would look at the DNS name and it would look like a random number, alphanumeric string of characters, dot, a domain.com. But running it through this decoder now, you can actually see what they were tagging your business entity as. And then that's important as well, because those researchers that have also been publicizing any domains that they knew were affected in the attack. So we're going to share both those things with you. There's a paste so you can go look at all the domains that were affected that have been shared. Go check and see if any of your domains are in that list, because if so, it's 100% confirmation that the backdoor was activated on your instance. And then also use that decoder because we have had some clients that weren't in that list, but we saw malicious traffic to those domains, and we could see essentially the domain names that they were targeting and exfilling as part of that attack. And then finally, the last piece of news is, and this is kind of new, and this one is kind of interesting. We may chat about it a little bit. So a lot of media outlets are starting to report that JetBrains, which is a code repo that was used by SolarWinds, Orion specifically, may have been involved in this attack. JetBrains is adamantly saying we were not breached. And so there's this is interesting just because of perspective, and I thought it may be good for us to chat on close about this so folks understand that, right? And talking about, Pinky, you had the good example of Twitter and that analogy about Twitter and like the presidential account or their government official accounts that were compromised and they were used to send out, phishing tweets. And a lot of people think, oh, Twitter was hacked. No, Twitter wasn't hacked. Those accounts were hacked. And from what we see, right, this looks to be the same thing for JetBrains. JetBrains wasn't hacked or exploited in this, but it's very likely that they used harvested credentials from SolarWinds employees to access those JetBrains code repositories, which could have led to the code injection we've seen later. So I think it's good sometimes to talk about these topics so people can understand those implications and understand the difference between a software or an entity being involved in an attack chain, but not necessarily meaning that entity was breached.
Yeah. I mean, we see that a lot. I think people will hear about people's accounts being hacked somewhere, or some kind of access to something happening, or something involved in an exploit, a third party, and people then start questioning that third party's security, right? And it comes back to the people involved and stuff, and what our password management is, multi-factor, various things like that. So.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, we had SolarWinds had their update server was accessible with that SolarWinds 123 password. Makes me really wonder what else was out there. What did their JetBrains accounts look like, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's like you said, it's really important to make that note. That's not the fault of JetBrains. If I have a bad password on an Office 365 account and no multi-factor and things like that, and that gets attacked, that's not Microsoft being attacked. Even if they take out, it's a global admin and they take my entire tenant down or something like that with it, still not Microsoft being hacked. It was, it was a bad move on my part.
Yeah, exactly.
It's important to keep that in mind.
Well, cool. I think that's everything we got today, guys. I appreciate Eric and Pinky, you guys joining us. Hopefully you had some fun here. I appreciate all of our attendees joining us as well. Hopefully this was informative. Hopefully you got something that's going to help you. We will send out notes like I mentioned before. I don't think, maybe we missed one question here. I do see. Go ahead,
There's
Eric.
a couple questions in the actual question and answer section here. We got Cliff asking, saying we use Duo. Anything I should check? Specifically, is there any kind of indicator of compromise or anything like that? Just Duo related in general for those compromises, the secrets or keys or whatever that's being used there.
Yeah, we'll get some information together and send you those links from the exploits, Cliff. That'd probably be easier than talking through here now, and making sure you have that. The big thing though would be looking for account abuse within your OA implementation, like Pinky had mentioned. Hopefully your logging set up on that OA implementation so you can see the actual source address of folks who are logging into your devices. So what I would recommend doing is looking for anomalies there. That's a big indicator. You typically know the geographic region that your users are going to be logging in from. So I'd pull those logs down first and look to see if there's any anomalies in there. There are some secondary things that we like to do in those investigations, such as fingerprinting the OS that's accessing, fingerprinting the browser type, and looking for anomalies. You'll learn that your users are pretty patternistic, so they'll use the same browser type consistently. And then if you see a different browser type actually log into that same user session, that's cause for investigation. Doesn't always mean that it is compromised, but it means it's an anomaly and it should be investigated. So a lot of standard anomaly checks in those logs is the best first approach. And I will send you the documentation from Duo, but yeah, I don't know, Pink, if you've got any other thing you'd like to add to those to the anomaly research.
No, not to that specifically. I am going to hit the other question here because we did have one more in the Q&A there. But no, that's a good call. Exactly that. Look for those anomalies, and then look at the document that Duo provided for that. So the other question we had was from John Spindler. He was asking about older versions of the SolarWinds software. So anything prior to that, or specifically asking how vulnerable are the older versions. And so this is a big distinction that I know Oscar was making early on. This is not a vulnerability. So don't think of this as being a bug in the software that they were able to exploit here. This was literally an implanted piece of malware into the update. So if you're operating before that update that came out in March, you're safe from this particular piece of malware. Now there may be other things that are vulnerable and some issues there as well. So always keep that in mind. We do always recommend stay up to date on patches. Why this one's such a painful one for everyone. But if you move up to those newer versions, the newer hot fixes, the most recently released patches, you'll get past that. So if you're starting out prior to the exploited update, and if you just move up to the newest ones, you should be fine there. And I do know that yes, upgrades can be painful in a lot of environments, so it's tough. But just keep that in mind. If you're before the exploited update, then you're not vulnerable to that, at least.
Yeah, for sure. This is one of those situations, right, where folks who followed best practice and they applied those patches were the ones who were actually affected. It's very unfortunate. We hate that. But still, go back. I'm going back to the default deny. If there's one thing I want to hammer on today, besides all those other points we always talk about, this is why default deny is important. If you had default deny on your critical infrastructure, they didn't have untethered access to the internet, you would have never had to worry about this, not one moment. And anyone who is affected by this would not have had to worry about this. So this is a good opportunity to go back to that infrastructure and start locking it down. Cool. Well, thanks again, everybody. We appreciate this. We are going to do these once a month. So in the meantime, if you guys do have specific questions or topics, feel free to reach out to us. We'll respond, give you answers on that. And if you have something you would like to see us cover in the future, let us know. We'll clue that in and make sure we get it on the board for you and get some information there. And any feedback is appreciated. You guys have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.